Welcome to the Veritas podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Bo Winegard. Bo is a commentator, podcaster, and academic studying social psychology. Bo, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, it's good to have you again. You've been on the channel before, and you're one of my favorite guests. And so I was excited to have you back on to hang out for a bit. And we're in a moment where I really want to talk to someone like you because you're a self-described moderate conservative. And I've been wanting to have a conversation about conservatism in general and the Republican Party and just kind of where it's at, because we're in an interesting moment, like about 6 months post-Trump. I do want to make a quick note for my viewers. I'm not going to ask Bo about his bio today just because we've had that conversation on this channel before. Like I was saying, he's been on the show before. If you're really interested in Bo's background, in the link in the description down below and on my channel, you can find the previous interview I did with Bo if you want to hear more about that, but I'm not going to make him repeat himself insofar as that goes. I'll start off by asking you, Bo, instead, with the moment that we're in, the way I'm thinking of it, Trump has been out of office for over 6 months. It seems like we're finally starting to focus on the Biden presidency, especially after the Capitol riot, insurrection, whatever you want to call it. It seemed like Trump was sort of ghosting the presidency. He was sort of like his shadow hanged over it for a while. I think because Biden is right now suffering his first like catastrophe as a president and with what's going on in Afghanistan, he is really becoming president in a very real way. And we've seen that it is at least hypothetically possible. It's going to be temporary because of the Afghanistan thing, but his approval ratings are underwater. They'll probably go back up, but we can see that it is possible for him to get into a very bad position. If right now, if it was October of 2024, a lot of people would be talking about which Republican is going to become president. I wanted to ask you in this moment, as a moderate conservative, do you feel optimistic? Do you feel like, because I know you're not a Trump guy and neither am I.
No.
And it's one of the reasons I like having you on the show is I get a little bit sick of the Trump stuff. And how do you feel just about the moment we're in terms of, are you optimistic, pessimistic? Biden is very weak, at least right now, and that can change, but he's weak. Trump is out of office. He may or may not run again. How are you feeling generally about the next few years?
I do wonder how this is probably more strongly related to personality than any objective, anything going on in the world. I'm pessimistic, but I think that's probably just my personality. So prognostication is what, at least 70% personality, maybe 30% what's happening in the world. The reason that I'm pessimistic though is because I see both political coalitions veering away from more like classical liberalism, which I consider myself a moderate conservative, meaning mostly that I think classical liberalism is cool and I want to preserve that or conserve that, right? So I'm more in the, I have plenty of disagreements with them, but I'm more in the sort of George Will conservative, coalition. What is conservative in the United States is to conserve classical liberalism. Obviously, Trump is not somebody who one could praise as trying to conserve classical liberalism, and the excesses of the left make the Democratic coalition, unappealing to somebody who wants to conserve that as well. So it is true that we focused a lot on Biden lately because of the withdrawal from Afghanistan and because of, I think, the rise of Delta and then debates about mandates, etc. It just shines a light on the Biden administration, whether the administration actually has much to do with what's actually happening or not. So we have focused on Biden more, but if you just look at the Republican coalition, it does not seem as though there is a candidate whom one could consider sort of like a classical liberal type who is viable for 2024. Right now, if you were predicting, now a lot can happen between now and then, right? Of course, but I don't see right now, probably you would say, even though he's taking somewhat of a hit because of Delta in Florida, you would still say DeSantis, if Trump doesn't run, would be the next favorite. DeSantis is not as bad as Trump, in my opinion. Clearly,
I think it's a safe bet.
It's
a low bar.
High, yeah, exactly. Not a high hurdle to clear there, though. Of course, but he clearly likes to participate in some like culture war, populist rhetoric. One could debate how serious the actual populist proposals are, but I don't even like the rhetoric. I don't like rhetoric that's too populist. I think you probably have to do a little populism. You go back, presidents have always sprinkled in populist slogans and sayings into their rhetoric. So I understand that and I accept that as part of the political game. But too much of that makes me uncomfortable.
Mm.
I don't know about, projecting who. Right now it's hard to project, of course, because we have the Afghanistan situation.
And it's very early. We've got almost 2 years before the campaign even really starts.
I think one thing that I've learned and just from following politics for, I don't know, 25, 30 years or whatever is, maybe that's too long. I mean, not in a sophisticated manner when I was in high school, but people forget things really quickly. And so
yes.
People make such a big deal and get so worked up about this is the end of Biden. Biden should resign like in a month, depending on how things work. Obviously, if you have a terror attack every couple of months, that will draw more attention to it. But if you don't, people will forget what's happening and what happened in Afghanistan right now. I mean, it just won't be that big of a deal. So it's hard, it's hard to project from.
Yeah, I always say the political memory span of the American public is maybe 2 weeks long. I typically say that unless something happens like 2 weeks before an election or even less.
Yeah, that might be too long.
Yeah. Well, and I was just going
Right?
to say 2 weeks is for things that are catastrophic. And I think this would have fit into that category. Most things, it's like 2 or 3 days, really. I think a great example is that when the Access Hollywood tape came out, that situation with Trump, that was about 3 weeks before the election. And he did plummet in the polls to a point that was unimaginably low. I mean, it was a catastrophe for Republicans, or so they thought. And then he was still supposed to lose according to the polls, but he had actually recovered somewhat, even in just the 2 or 3 weeks that he had after that tape, which was this, whole brouhaha. And so, I think that it's smart for us. I'm going to keep us away from the conversation of talking about so much who it's going to be. But I am interested in sort of grading some of the possibilities. I know you brought up DeSantis, and I think you're right insofar that if you just had to guess right now, he seems the most obvious person besides Trump. With DeSantis, I actually think that he's in an interesting spot where he's not the person I would pick. He's not my favorite, but what I like about him from an electoral standpoint, and this is what I used to be a political operative, so this is where that kind of comes. I think
practically here.
Practically, and it's funny because I kind of played for the other team, but at this point, I think of DeSantis as he is possibly the only person who is not a total moron. He's not a Marjorie Taylor Greene, not a lunatic. He is intelligent. And he is capable of governing at least half decently. He's had some success in Florida, obviously some issues, but he's been relatively popular up until the last few weeks. And the thing that he does while doing all of that is that he is actually relatively well liked by the Trump base. And what that means is you don't really lose, like the Trump base wants Trump. That is who they want. But DeSantis to them is somebody that they would say, okay, we're still going to turn out to fight against the woke orthodoxy, to fight against what the Democrats are doing if Ron DeSantis is the candidate, whereas they might not if it's a Nikki Haley, for instance. And DeSantis does that while not being a total fucking idiot. I mean, to be frank, I mean, you have if you have a Marjorie Taylor Greene, or there's plenty of people that I could mention who are just not, it's unimaginable the damage they could do to the Republican Party. So I think that he fits into kind of a little sweet spot for me where he's not my first choice, and he's probably not even in my top 5 of people I'd want to be president. Probably not even in my top 10. But I view him as somewhat of a consensus choice where he's right in the sweet spot of Trump's base will go out and vote for him enthusiastically. And moderate Democrats, if the Biden-Harris administration continues to struggle, would also. And he's gutsy insofar that I could actually see him making meaningful steps to fight the woke orthodoxy, which is my number one concern. And I know one of your top concerns is just the illiberal attitudes that are appearing on the left. How would you sort of take that as far as DeSantis goes?
Well, so everything you said, I basically agree with. I mean, he does seem to be, he's like the one potential candidate as of now, whom I could see the National Review endorsing enthusiastically, and the Trump base being happy about. Of course, this is supposing Trump doesn't run, because if Trump runs, I think we just have to.
And it's Trump and not Trump.
Yeah,
then it's
Trump's going to win anyways. I think if
probably
the primary, at least, not the election, but the primary. Yeah. So in absence of Trump, I think DeSantis is this one person who can be the synthesizer. So if you're somebody, and a lot of the people say at the National Review would be interested in the synthesis, they're not. You can, like, the bulwark Republicans, if you can call them Republicans, whatever you want to call it, the bulwark types, they're not interested in synthesis, right? Their view is you have to eradicate the Trumpist cancer. So they might not like DeSantis. I would be surprised if they were enthusiastic or even moderately warm to DeSantis. But I think most other people, all of the people who want a synthesis, they want to bring these coalitions together in the Republican Party. I think DeSantis is the one person who could do it. Now the fighting the woke thing, if I recall correctly, I think we ended our conversation even talking about Twitter and like what you could do on Twitter. And it's still a complicated question. I don't have an answer yet, but that's where it seems to me that the actual proposals DeSantis has forwarded are like clearly and transparently designed to get applause from the culture warriors while actually doing very little. So if you looked at, for example, the tech bill with the carve out for Disney, which it's like, yeah, you leave a carve out for Disney because they're obviously big in Florida. And then almost every legal scholar I heard talk about it just said there's not a chance that this will pass through the courts. So I don't know. I don't have like a great idea about what one could actually do to fight wokeism, if you will. I do think the one thing that I would say, and I think we probably would agree on this, is I'm very open, but I think this would have to happen more on a local level, but I'm very open to getting, now we can talk, it's a really complicated thing, what CRT is, but I'm very open to getting that out of K through 12 schooling. I think that's something where I would argue that actually the classical liberal solution is to treat it as a religion. And what we did with religion is we said, we're getting this out of the public domain in a certain sense, right? Because that actually increases our freedom of expression, etc., because we don't have people tearing each other to shreds about it in the school system. That's what I think we could agree on that. I don't know how you would do that. I don't know if that should be, I don't know if you should attack that at the federal level though, right? So that's more of a complicated procedural issue.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to talk about critical race theory. So I'm glad you brought it up. It seems to be, I almost feel like critical race theory has become this new playing field for the culture war, kind of the new dividing line. To some extent, the way that I know it seems like feminism was kind of a place where, like, from 2014 to 2018, you could kind of tell where somebody stood in the culture wars, not by asking them which party they were registered to, but just ask them, like, what do you think about feminism? And then I think now we've got this critical race theory situation. And yeah, I'm very for being pretty harsh in trying to eradicate. It's to me, I think calling it essentially a state religion is very important and a really smart thing to do, because it effectively is.
Yes.
And it's just so transparently awful. I mean, if you've seen the discourse on it, it's just racism. Like, it's just racism by another name. And it's been so bizarre to see how they've tried to defend it on the left by saying that, oh, it's teaching kids about slavery, which we've done for about 150 years. Like, I was in school and they were like, slavery is very bad. Here's what happened. Like, I'm from a relatively conservative area. I mean, I don't know where in the world they were teaching kids that slavery was good or that it didn't happen. It's just such a weird defense that no one could possibly believe.
It's kind of a semantic Calvin ball. I mean, maybe that's not, it's definitely Mott Bailey, right? Because what you get is, as you say, when we talk about CRT and we lament it or we assail it, then you get people on the left, like an AOC type, saying, why do Republicans want to silence people who are just teaching about Jim Crow? Or, it's framed that way. It's like, nobody is opposed to that. Nobody. I mean,
literally
maybe,
no one.
Maybe there's one Ku Klux Klan member
like
in Georgia or something, like whatever. But we've been teaching that for 100, 50. It depends on where you are, obviously. And like, I'm not going to defend some of the lost cause BS that was taught in the South for a while, and that was atrocious. But yeah, so we have to be clear when we're saying CRT, when you and I are, we're talking about this sort of metaphysical package, this view about humans belonging to these essential categories, white privilege, doing these, what are these, privilege walks or whatever they are, right, all of this kind of stuff. It's the contentious debates about race and then the metaphysics that we care about. And like, I would make this point, and this is a point I've tried to make, and I haven't had anybody debate me about this, which I would like to do, which is, if you support teaching CRT in K through 12, would you also support teaching the bell curve? If it's about free speech, then you would also have to say that you're going to defend a 4th grade teacher who decides to teach that the reason you have gaps is because of differences in traits. And I don't think many people are willing to go down that path. So what I would say is, well, let's come to a compromise about this. We're not going to work this debate out in K through 12. It's not going to happen, right? If you want to teach white privilege at your house, go ahead. That's fine. I don't have a problem. Or in a private school. But in the public school, I think we just kick that stuff out. And also, it's like, look, 3rd graders are not like children Socrates waiting to have these, very complicated dialectical exchanges. We're teaching them basic skills and some kind of, in my view, and this is, somebody can debate me on this. I understand that it's a complicated issue, but some kind of civic patriotism, in my view. That's what you're trying to teach kids. You're not teaching kids about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and you're not teaching them about white privilege or some other metaphysical concept. So, but I do think it's important that when we have this discussion, we have to lock down the definition, or at least make clear what it is we're talking about, so that the other side can't do the, well, all we're talking about is teaching slavery and stuff.
Yeah, I think that the right has actually been doing a relatively good job of jumping on this really quickly, because there are so many different lanes of attack. It's a huge overstep, in my opinion, by the left to be doing this.
So, yeah.
There's the lane of attack that you were mentioning in terms of like, I mean, I could take it one step further. The bell curve is, at least in theory, and I'm not well educated enough on the topic to have a solid debate on it. I'm vaguely aware of the situation of the bell curve and race and IQ in that discussion, but I know at least that it's supposed to be based in science. It is a scientific concept,
claim. Right, exactly.
Whereas this is a state religion, and it's it is rooted in very racist ideas. And we in the United States have established, through, ironically, civil rights laws that were meant to protect Black Americans, that you cannot discriminate based on race in a public school. So if you went around teaching a different form of what I call blood libel, that was the word I was going to use, is it's essentially blood libel, where they're going around telling these kids, because you're white, you are somehow responsible for these things that took place decades or even centuries ago. And
you're somehow linked to your ancestors.
Yeah, it's like telling me that because I'm Jewish, I killed Jesus. It's like the same. It's so bizarre.
Exactly.
And and to me, it's like, it would be like teaching a Black kid that they're responsible for whatever Black people have been doing. It's just such a bizarre.
That you're responsible for O.J. Simpson's crime somehow because you're Black. You share in that essence somehow, right? I agree. It's bafflingly. It is like literally the dictionary definition of racism, right? That version of it, at least. Yeah.
Well, in a version that we have established in the United States, we don't do, like, we just don't do this in any public space. So I think it's very easy if our systems haven't completely fallen apart, and right now the Supreme Court has a strong conservative majority, throw it all the way up there. For God's sake, all we have to do is say, look at the existing laws. We don't even have to change anything. Let's use existing federal statutes against discrimination in publicly funded institutions, and say you cannot round up a bunch of children in a school and tell them that they're different because of their skin color, and start and imply or even explicitly state that one of them is guilty and one of them is a victim because of their skin. It's to me, I don't understand why they're even attempting to do this, because it's built on these little stilts.
Why the left is?
I mean, I guess I understand why they're attempting to do it, because it's a form of propaganda, and they think it's going to be effective in the long run.
Yeah, I think importantly, I think what happens is when you so dominate these kinds of institutions, which obviously the left does, right? They dominate higher education, they dominate the mainstream media. People will always say, well, look at how many viewers Fox gets. Yeah, but Fox is one channel versus a bunch of channels and a bunch of newspaper outlets. The New York Times, the Boston Globe, the LA Times, the Atlantic, et cetera, are all predominantly left, especially on cultural issues, right? That's where they're even more to the left. So I think what happens is, if you're a leftist and you're in this milieu in which the left just commands these institutions, you end up overreaching, right?
You get too comfortable.
Let's make this push. Yeah, exactly. Let's make this push. And also, I mean, I think on average, educators, even K through 12 educators, are more to the left than the average person in their community, right? And so they talk to each other, they go to these teaching seminars where you invite Ibram Kendi or something, and so you get this problem, which is I think, yes, overreach, coupled with this, or maybe partially caused by this kind of blindness to the attitudes of the average person and how they feel about this, and that, like, the average person doesn't want their white son being told that he's ipso facto racist and sexist. Like, I have ordinary friends who are actually to the left who are just like, I don't want this shit, like my son learning this shit. They actually just like really are really disgusted by it. So, but now again, it's important to separate some things, because I think so how do we deal with, like, say, white privilege? Does that violate any principle to teach the idea of white privilege? Probably not. Is it something that if I had a kid, would I want my kid learning about it? No, not at all. Not at all, because it's first of all, as we said, like, take the bell curve. That's an empirical claim. White privilege is actually an empirical claim, but it's taught as a religious dogma. It's not. These people don't forward evidence, and we could get into it. I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming that there's no such thing. But even if there is, that's a very complicated empirical issue, and that's not what they're teaching in fourth grade. They're teaching, this is definitely a thing. White people, you need to recognize and, I guess, feel guilty about your privilege and understand all of the terrible things that these minority people have to go through that you don't have to go through, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so it's complicated in that sense, because I agree some of this is just obviously shouldn't be taught and, like, clearly runs afoul of existing law. Some of it probably doesn't run afoul of it, but we should kick it out of the school, in my view, as a kind of compromise. That's how I feel about it. It's like a culture war compromise. We're not going to settle these issues, and if we bring them into the K through 12 situation, it's like throwing fuel on it. People are just going to get more angry at each other, and it actually will undermine freedom, not increase it. That's the thing that, Jason Stanley, David French, and Thomas Chatterton Williams. I'm sorry, I forget.
That sounds right. I've seen it. Yeah, Thomas Chatterton Williams.
Yeah, they wrote this op-ed for the New York Times, like, sort of talking of, banning CRT is the wrong way to do it, and they raise these freedom of speech concerns and marketplace of ideas, and it's just, K through 12 is not a marketplace of ideas, because again, I will guarantee you that if a teacher taught that the reason that there are these disparities is because there's a 15-point IQ gap, and it's probably caused by genes, that teacher would get fired. And David French would not be defending that teacher. Jason Stanley would not be. Now, if they would be, they can prove me wrong, and I will gladly say I was wrong, but I am very skeptical that they would. And I know that the New York Times wouldn't. There is not a chance the New York Times would have op-eds defending a teacher who taught that. So it's not a marketplace of ideas. It's just not. That's a lie. Let's get rid of that and talk about really what's going on and how best we can move forward.
Yeah, well, and just like if you had a local school board and a community, let's say in a land that's somewhat forgotten by time, like maybe a very small town in Alabama or something, there's a place where they want to teach more of the lost cause, kind of like, you know, the South should have won the Civil War. Nobody would be defending that. And I think that your point about, one thing I can say about the race and IQ discussion is, even if I'm not quite well educated enough on the topic to have a strong opinion on it, I know enough about it to say no one under the age of 18 in a school environment should be having that. I mean, if they want to talk among friends and they happen to be interested, great. But to sit down a bunch of, and you would, and I knew you would agree with me on that.
Yes,
and I know you're interested in that stuff. But
no need for a 7th grade teacher to say, hey, let's have a race and IQ debate in class today.
Yeah, that's a terrible idea. And everyone knows that would be a terrible idea.
Yes.
And it's also transparently obvious to any reasonable person that it's terrible to be like, let's talk about how the responsibility that white children hold for the suffering of the historical suffering of Black people. Just if you just say it, and I'm not even trying to like make it sound such, I'm just talking about what I understand CRT to be, which is this hyper focus on Black historical suffering in the United States and the responsibilities that white people, even those who are not directly responsible for anything, and there are so many problems with it. It doesn't make any sense. The academic standards behind the studies that go into it, the Black studies, are just terrible. They're terrible. And it also it so obviously doesn't help us come together as a multi-ethnic country. It like, if that's the goal, which is supposedly the goal, is to help us coexist as Black, white, you know, brown, etc. It's if you take 2 seconds to look at the material that is being discussed, and I would say for people listening, this is the best way to respond to when recently there was a debate between Malcolm Nance and Ben Shapiro. Did you happen to see that on real time?
I didn't. No.
On Bill Maher, Malcolm Nance, who's the worst, and Ben Shapiro, who I'm generally a fan of. He's not perfect, but I generally like him. He was having a debate about critical race theory. And of course, Malcolm Nance, who's kind of playing from the left, did the like, oh, I just want to teach about Jim Crow and slavery. Why don't you want to teach about that? And Ben Shapiro did a pretty good job, but I think he could have done a better job. And what you need to do in those situations is directly state actual things that have happened in classrooms. Because Chris Rufo does this research. If you don't know Chris Rufo, look him up. He brings out what is actually happening in the materials that are being discussed. Just quote those and say, is that Jim Crow? Is that slavery? And then I think if we just do that on a national stage, and this kind of comes back to the presidential conversation, if we can have a candidate who's not Donald Trump, who is intellectually capable of doing that, because Donald Trump had a moment, I think we might have talked about this in our last discussion, he had a moment where he was talked about the police brutality situation, obviously last year, almost feels like it was 2 years ago. And he flubbed it because he's just not that smart. He's just not very articulate, and he barely was able to answer the question at all. And if we just have somebody who on a national debate stage, that debate, I think, had 80 million viewers. Could you imagine the good that could have been done by an articulate conservative pushing back on the narrative that Black people are being hunted in the streets? And then if we could do that with CRT, again, people think that working through these presidential election processes are so, you know, irrelevant to the culture wars. And it's like, no, actually, when you have 100 million people watching something on television, if somebody really states something, if they kind of counter program against woke propaganda, I think that you score some points. I mean, it's more or less what happened when Jordan Peterson had his Kathy Newman moment and 30 million people watched it. It was the last time that I remember feeling like, ooh, the heterodox coalition got like a solid win. We got like a good haymaker. And like, that was a moment where I was showing a lot of people and they were like, man, that woman is awful. People who you wouldn't expect to side with a Jordan Peterson. So yeah.
So I mean, I think about obviously like culture stuff quite a bit. And I think the problem is it's 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 like the proverbial drop of water in the ocean, which is to say you can never tell which drop actually did anything, right? So when you're thinking about can you change culture, most of the stuff does nothing, right? But enough of it and you do a little bit, right? And it's just hard to know what is what's helping, what's not. Because I look on Twitter often and I feel as though there are a bunch of Don Quixotes. You know, it's like, what are you guys doing? So what? And I do the same thing. I do it too, right? I participate and I'm like, what are we even doing here? But once in a while, first of all, persistent, if enough people are doing it and making the arguments, that matters, right? Because you know, I have had emails, I'm sure a lot of other people have had emails from young, you know, undergrads or whatever saying, hey, I read this article or I read this tweet thread and like that was cool and like you changed my mind or whatever. So that happens. But obviously, I don't have 80 million people paying attention to what I'm doing, or even 20. So if you get 20 million people and you had this hypothetical, very articulate, persuasive conservative making the case against CRT, bringing attention to the real CRT, right? That's the other thing, right? Because obviously you get this very tendentious account from the New York Times, from MSNBC, from NBC, from ABC, etc. You do not get a realistic account of some of this stuff. As you said, Chris Rufo and other people have drawn attention to some of the real teachings. And I know some of the people who teach this shit, and I know how bad it is, right? I mean, like, these people, they think they're doing the right thing, right? Like,
Yeah.
many of them are decent people. Like I don't think it's worth, you know, having animus toward them. I have animus toward the ideology, but a lot of them are just true believers and they teach stuff that, yeah, it's really alarming and we should be vexed by it. And yeah, if we had I agree with you. I guess this is a roundabout way of saying I definitely agree with you. It does matter, even though it's hard to know how much it matters. And it would be nice to have somebody also maybe on the left, but I don't think you'll ever get that because you wouldn't be a viable candidate on the left if you went against some of this madness. But yeah, if you had I don't know if DeSantis could be, I mean, my concern with DeSantis, just to make this point, and this is my concern with some people on the right, is that to some degree trolling the libs becomes this appealing activity because it gets you immediate attention. Maybe it's fun, like I get it, it's kind of fun sometimes. I don't like it. Now it's an empirical question how effective it is, but I just think from my own view, if I were somebody sitting on the fence and I listened to some of DeSantis's, not all, but some of what he does, or I saw some of it, it would alienate me a little bit. Now, maybe I'm the weird one, and maybe that's not actually the real political calculus here, but I tend to be more attracted to people who attempt to persuade and are charitable toward the other side. Now, maybe there's no place for that, and maybe politics is not the place for that, but that's what I would like to see personally.
I think what you're sort of alluding to for me is to a certain extent just a basic likability factor. I mean, when somebody is viciously attacking the other side, even if it's just sort of the standard procedure attacks of their party, it definitely makes it so that, yes, they're going to drum up enthusiasm among the people who already agree with them. And that's one way to win elections.
Right.
But anyone that's looking for a kind of adult in the room, and I think there are more Americans looking for this than people realize. I think it sounds like you're looking for it. I'm certainly looking for it. Somebody who tries to be above the fray and say, look, I will make the arguments I'm going to make, but I don't want to engage in the kind of mudslinging that the American people are truly sick of. And I think there's a much larger percentage of the American people that are looking for this than people think. If you had a candidate like that, somebody who just by basically saying, look at the left, and like, if you want, you can look at Trump. But I hypothetically, I assume the only way you're going to get an even half decent candidate for president for the next 15 years is a Republican. I hate to say that. I hate to, but
no, I think
yeah,
right, unfortunately.
but I assume probably a Republican is that if you can get someone who is strong in their convictions, and they don't, because I think the problem is one of the people who comes to mind is Mitt Romney. I think Romney has a little bit too much of a reputation at this point for, even if it's unearned, I think it's a little unfair. People think of him as kind of like a spineless capitulator. That's at least the reputation he has.
Yeah.
So I don't think he would quite do it, but like a Ben Sass, I'm kind of a fan of, or I think there are people where if they can be this kind of above the fray, but strong, they seem upright. Somebody who's almost like the electoral equivalent to Jordan Peterson, I would think of. I bring him up a lot on my channel, but it's because I'm a fan of his. I think that he had that perfect balance. He never ran for office, obviously. I'd certainly welcome it if he did, but although it'd be Canadian anyway.
He's Canadian,
but, yeah. Maybe he'll dethrone Justin Trudeau or something. That'd be cool. But he has that perfect balance of strength meets likability. He's a genuinely likable person. I mean, if you don't like Jordan Peterson, I don't know what's wrong with you. Like, people don't like him for ideological reasons,
right? But
he's a genuinely
personally,
he seems kind. He seems like a kind, good human.
He has a kind of charisma as well, right? Which is,
and it's not Trump charisma. It's not based in nastiness.
No, it's not. I think we might be the deluded ones, though, because what I always think about is, it's like we're talking about.
There's the pessimist.
Yeah, because if this is true, all these politicians throughout the 20th century, at least, and certainly before that, but that I've read their biographies or autobiographies or biographies of them, they don't want to sling mud, right? It's this really important thing to them, but they all do, or they let somebody else do it for them because it works, because especially as negative polarization gets more intense, right? That is to say, people aren't voting because they like you. They're voting because they hate the other person. And what that means is it's in your interest to make them hate the other person even more. And you can see, for example, the 2016, to the extent that Trump had a strategy. And I think there's actually an interesting debate about how smart is Trump, and just instinctively, how smart is he versus how much is he just a walking it. I think he's instinctively smart. I think he has this sort of intuition about what people want and what he needs to do, and this is why he's a successful brander, despite the fact that I find him loathsome. You probably find him loathsome. He's done a good job with this, and what he understood, I think, or at least the people around him, is you're not going to win by making people like you because people don't like you. You're going to win by making people hate politics and hate Clinton. You suppress the turnout, and then you turn out the people who really hate Clinton, and then you get some of those people who sort of checked out of the political system altogether, who came out to vote in 2016, who are what they would call low propensity voters. It's an effective strategy, right? Because you just make them hate the other side. You can see they tried to do this with Biden. They did the Hunter Biden stories and all of this mudslinging toward the end. It turns out it wasn't quite enough, but to be fair, that election was really close, right? The 2021 was really close.
Relatively, it was about as close as 2012. It wasn't a landslide, but it wasn't like a barn burner either. It was
But if you look at, let's say so the percentage, but if you looked at, say, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin.
Electoral college, it actually was. It came down to probably about 60,000 votes, as I understand it, which was pretty darn close.
Right. So you think about that. That's, let's say it's, between 60 and 200,000, whatever. It's, that's.
It could have gone the other way. Right. I can only imagine.
I think we're just, as unfortunate as it is, I think it just turns out that restraint in this kind of a sense that we care about, this kind of decency and attempt to persuade and be forceful without engaging in almost nihilistic partisanship, I think that's something that has to come from the top down. I think it's an agreement that elites and intellectuals and respectable analysts have to engage in a kind of self-control, because the fact of the matter is being a demagogue works, right? This is something that obviously goes all the way back to the Greeks, but the founding fathers, for example, recognized this and specifically attempted to put checks into the system because they realized that being a demagogue was an effective strategy. So I think this restraint has to come from the top down more. So I think what happens is when you get somebody who blows up these norms and shows that you can do it, it just encourages more people to do it, right? So the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world, the Lauren Boeberts, they've realized you can just go nihilistic tribalism. Don't even try to grapple with reality. Doesn't matter. Your whole shtick is the other side is pure evil, right? They are terrible. They're going to take your guns. They hate you. Elites hate you. I mean, like the Afghanistan thing, obviously I'm not an expert on foreign policy. It's a very complicated issue. But what is interesting about this is Trump wanted out, signed a deal that many people criticized at the time with the Taliban. And many people said it was basically a capitulation to them. I don't know. We could debate that. But now all of the people in that populist coalition are absolutely assailing Biden for doing it. And, you know, look, like we can talk about the evacuation. It's actually, I think it's logistically difficult and it's easy to pretend there's a perfect solution. There's not. It's not going to be pleasant no matter how you do it. I'm sure there were mistakes. We can imagine doing it more effectively. We could also imagine it going a lot worse, right? But whatever the case is, now what you have are these very same people criticizing Biden vehemently for doing what Trump said he wanted to do, right? To me, that's a kind of nihilistic partisanship, which I really dislike, because what would be more constructive is trying to work together and say, look, like, here were the mistakes. Let's figure out how to do this better. Not everything is your fault. You fucked up everything, right?
Yeah, well, and the completely shameless flip-flopping is
yes.
Everything that you said, I would, summarize my reaction insofar just to say that your point is well taken, that perhaps I paint a rosier picture of the electorate when I say there needs to be an adult in the room candidate than I should. And I would respond by saying that I think what you're saying is true. I think that people need almost to experience a certain type of catharsis through their chosen political candidate. They need to feel them as an extension of themselves, and they like to see that extension of themselves successfully attacking the other side and branding the other side. I mean, Donald Trump's the king of branding. He'd give people nicknames. I mean, he was really good at branding not just himself, but his opponents.
Yes.
What was it? Was it Lying Hillary? I can't. Oh, Crooked Hillary.
Crooked
Hillary and Lion Ted was
Lil Marco, Lion Ted, and Sleepy Joe.
And I think that you need to have some of that. The point I would make, I don't even know if you would necessarily disagree with this, but I think that I would adjust my position insofar that I guess if I use the example of Jordan Peterson, he's probably a little too nice. He would be too far on the side of the spectrum where he probably couldn't run for office in that way, at least not in the United States, and sort of Jordan Peterson's really good at playing defense and he's pretty good at playing offense, but he probably couldn't play offense quite well enough, right, to get the job done, considering what you just said about the American electorate. It's almost like Jordan Peterson is the hero we don't deserve, right? Like he's the hero we need, but our electorate couldn't handle him. I do think that there's a person out there somewhere, and maybe we don't even know who they are yet. Maybe they appear in 20, 30 years. Maybe the Dark Knight arrives out of the shadows. I think there's somebody who can have the maturity and the tact, knowing how to sort of tactfully attack the other side and score the points that you have to score if you want to get 50% plus one and win elections, but at the same time has a certain degree of restraint and engages in likability politics, which I don't think should be discounted either. And I guess I can't necessarily think of a specific person. I think there are people who come close, like a Jordan Peterson. I was saying before that Ron DeSantis doesn't quite get there, but he certainly gets a lot closer than I think a lot of other candidates. And I feel like if we could just find someone who is kind of, I'm trying to articulate the type of person. They're able to sort of have these, let's say, viral moments, these moments where they really have gotten a good hit in and they make people feel that catharsis and that sense of we won that, that exchange, whether it's in a debate or just in a cultural skirmish. And yet at the same time, if they can have the restraint and sort of have this, if they can give America the feeling that like, hey, do you want to be normal again? Like, do you want to have like an adult president who isn't as craven as Kamala Harris, as kind of out of it as Joe Biden, as spineless as Joe Biden, frankly, or nor as boorish as Donald Trump? And if, I guess I'm asking for a somewhat of a perfect person, but hell, it's the president of the United States. It's a reasonable standard, right?
It should be.
Yeah, it should be close to it.
I mean, the person I like the most, although I don't share his foreign policy views, or at least completely share them, is Ben Sasse. But Ben Sasse, I don't think he has a chance of winning a Republican primary in this atmosphere, because he is despised by Trump. He clearly does not like Trump. He does not like that part of the Republican coalition, and they don't like him. And that's a significant part. I mean, an important thing is a lot of, and I do think this is important. I had a debate with somebody about this on Twitter, but I would defend this position. A lot of being a Republican now is just deference to Trump. So for example, Stefanik, who's now the third in charge in the House, has a much lower voting with Trump rate than Liz Cheney. Liz Cheney's is in the 90s. I think Stefanik's, when I looked, was somewhere in the 60s. Most
one's from Wyoming, one's from New York. Oh yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, well, you know, Liz Cheney basically voted, as you would expect, for a representative from Hawaii, or Wyoming.
That'd be different.
Yeah, very different. But Cheney she committed the one unforgivable sin in today's Republican Party. She explicitly and consistently pushed back against Trump on the election, and then on the January 6th, whatever we want to call that. And so the argument I got back was, well, look, Mitch McConnell, he gave this absolutely withering speech after the impeachment hearing. Other people have been very critical of Trump or of what happened on January 6th. And that is true. But Liz Cheney has consistently done it. Mitch McConnell did it once, and I give him credit. That was an absolutely devastating speech. But he did that once and moved on. Liz Cheney, to her credit, in my view, was like, no, if somebody brings it up, I'm going to say what I think about it. And you had all these Republicans saying, what we need to do is just move on. But while they were saying we just need to move on, Donald Trump brings this up all the time. In fact, his conspiracies have gotten crazier. They paid Indians now. They paid people.
Well, and he drums up the reinstatement rumors.
Right, exactly. So he's not letting it go. And notice what happens. The Republican Party blames Liz Cheney because Trump is crazy and promotes these ridiculous conspiracy theories. And Liz Cheney says, no, that's not right, and it's her fault. So I think that illustrates the problem with the Republican Party, which is they're completely beholden to an absolute clown car, this clown who leads the coalition now. Now, I understand that politics is a game of pragmatism. And so if you have to run for president, and if running for president means you cannot fully criticize Trump, that's fine. I accept that, right? But I don't like it. And also, I think for intellectual hygiene and honesty, people like you and me, who are very critical of the woke excesses on the left, should also be very critical of the Trump excesses on the right. And I don't see a lot of that. And it disconcerts me, right? Because I see a lot of people who correctly, I think, despise CRT and that kind of a thing, but they are absolutely terrified to criticize Trump, to say anything about Trump, or to say anything about some of the excessive nonsense of populists on the right? And that disconcerts me. I think it's a problem. And that's just another reason I'm pessimistic, by the way, because now to the likability, just on the last point on that. Yeah, I shouldn't let my pessimism sort of steal my soul, because I do think there is room for that. And whatever one thinks of Obama, I mean, yeah, he was tendentious. He was kind of unfair and professorial and acted as though, he was on the right side of history. And if you were against him, you just didn't understand history. But dude was likable, and he was certainly different from and more, what would you say, elevated, responsible, congenial than Trump. And I mean, so there was a likability factor even there.
The word I think you might have been looking for is like presidential. At the end of the day, we look
There
for
you
people
go.
who have a certain
That's fine.
maturity, and Barack Obama
Yes.
acted like a 45-year-old man, whereas Donald Trump has a tendency
Yes.
to waffle between acting like a very old man and a very young child.
Right. Like all decent adults, Obama would in private, he would say, "Who is this motherfucker?" In public, he would not, he wouldn't give somebody the name Lil Marco. Like, I mean, it's seriously like, a small part of me thinks it's kind of funny sometimes, of course, but it really is kind of elementary, and you do expect better from a leader. Like, a leader is supposed to, in my view, encourage the best traits, the better angels of our nature, if you will. Because of course we all have these impulses to make fun of people, to mock them, to laugh at the misery of the other side. We need a leader to elevate the best of us and to suppress the worst, right? Not to encourage the worst, which is essentially what, in my view, Trump mostly did.
Yeah, and it seems like prior to Trump, presidents by and large were pretty good at this part of the job. I can't think of, I mean, I know Andrew Jackson was apparently kind of a crazy bastard, but you'd have to go back pretty far, right? And it's like, and he wasn't making televised addresses, so it was only so much of a problem.
Yeah.
But for the most part, even if you think about some of our worst presidents, Jimmy Carter, Richard Nixon, it's like, they would get up there and make a speech and they do it like a statesman.
Yes.
These are some of our worst presidents. Carter,
yeah, I think Nixon's
like,
a good example because obviously we have these tapes now from Nixon, and he rants like a crazy man.
Yeah, very much not meant for public consumption.
Exactly. but importantly, it is true in his public speeches, and he's accused of the Southern strategy and racism, etc. But actually, if you listen to his speeches, he is very tolerant and cosmopolitan and emphasizes that. Yes, he does emphasize crime, which really was a problem at the time. But yes, he was his speeches were very presidential, very nationalistic in a way that was not incendiary or divisive, in my view. And yes, you're right. Now, to be fair, I think we used to just consider that a pretty, the proverbial low hurdle to jump, right?
Bare minimum.
It's like, of course, if you're the president, you try to bring people together. You don't just talk to the 30% of fervent followers. Like Trump for 4 years was basically talking to that 39% who had a favorable opinion of his presidency.
No matter what happened. He never went lower than like 38%.
Yeah, it was like there was this real, it was like basically he was on the floor the whole time. It couldn't go, no matter what he did, it was not going below that.
Yeah, I think that as we talk about this, one of the things I think about is because I want to. One thing I try to do on the show is always be kind of solutions focused and looking towards what to actually do about these problems. And I really want there to be an option in 2024 because with Trump, hopefully, maybe, and I'm actually not completely hopeless that he might just not run. Mm-hmm. So if he doesn't run, there is the opportunity because this last election, I actually didn't vote for president. I skipped the box. I did not vote for Biden or Trump. I could not do it. I wrote in Tulsi Gabbard's name, which is basically a no vote because they didn't count it because she wasn't a write-in candidate. Right. So, I'm a patriot. I want to vote for president. I voted for everything else. Like I hated having to do that. I feel like in 2024, I'm excited at the notion that for the first time in a while, I did vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016. And I would defend that vote to this day, actually. But,
I did too.
But I feel like once again, I'll hopefully be able to fucking vote for president, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I think in doing so, I'm looking for the best case scenario. And I realize, and you made a good point about this earlier, the primary system is very, very bad for what we're talking about. Having somebody navigate through a primary naturally makes them want to throw out the red meat, go as far in the direction as their most fervent, because who votes in primaries? The most fervent people on either side.
Terrible system.
And so what I'm thinking, though, is there is a way to bypass this. It's called either a third party candidacy or an independent candidacy. And I want to ask you about Brett Weinstein's Unity campaign. Now, of course, Unity, are you familiar with Brett Weinstein's Unity campaign at all?
Just vaguely.
So basically, just to explain the basic concept, it failed miserably in 2020 just because it started way too late. He didn't start it until I think it was July of 2020, which, to be fair, was about a month after the riots, and was when things became. Sorry, I have a siren that's going to pass by.
Right. It's Chicago.
Yeah, that's just how it. Okay, that's gone. All right, so. Speaking of riots, but anyway, right after the riots, Brett Weinstein, like many of us did, had a moment where he was like, holy shit, I want to do something. And so he started this Unity campaign. For anyone that's listening, you might not know either. So I'll explain it to Bo and I'll explain it to you. More or less, he was going to have a system where he said, let's get for lack of a better word, moderate, even though that's not necessarily the best word, but a moderate leftist candidate, a moderate right-wing candidate, to have a Unity ticket where basically they flip a coin. Whoever wins is president for the first term, and hypothetically, when they run for the second term, the other person becomes president, and they switch the other person to vice president. And that also part of this idea is that who's president and vice president would be somewhat of a formality, because the idea would be that these two people would govern as a team, that they would basically be a almost co-presidency between two people who come from moderate left and moderate right backgrounds. He tried to draft the two people that he ended up attempting to draft were Tulsi Gabbard and who's the congressman who lost an eye, and Dan Crenshaw. And but on his short list, there was also I can't remember the name. It might've been Wesley Clark, some general. And then maybe not Wesley Clark. I get the generals confused, but Andrew Yang and some of these other people that are just a little bit more decent, moderate, not necessarily the best word. But I was intrigued by this idea. There's some of the stuff you'd have to work out. But the thing I liked most about it was I was like, these people don't have to do a primary. I mean, this is going to be probably an independent ticket of people who, they can be registered to either party. It doesn't matter. And I'm kind of intrigued. It started way too late. They didn't even get ballot access. They couldn't draft the candidates. It was a miserable failure in 2020. And it was obvious from the beginning that it would be. But in 2024, with enough preparation, I am intrigued at the concept. And I'm curious what you would think.
I guess it just strikes me as political fantasy. I mean, it's like realistically, the chances that any kind of third party candidate would succeed are almost nothing. And the chances that this particular variety of third party candidate would succeed, I think, are literally nothing. I would literally bet my life that coalition, those two people, will not win the election. That's not to say that it's always a bad exercise or pointless, because even if you don't win, even if you get 1% of the vote, let's say, it is making a point, right? It is drawing attention to something and showing that some people are irritated with these two choices or whatever it happens to be. They're nettled by it and they want to go elsewhere. I personally wouldn't participate in it because I think that we have to deal with reality. I'm firmly in the John Adams camp of we have to deal with humans as they exist. Therefore, what I would say is, I think the best solution, and something that I try to encourage in people, is to stop caring so much about the presidency and to start caring more about Congress and then local politics. Now, let's forget the local politics, because that gets a little more complicated. And I think there are reasonable debates about why people don't care as much about local politics. So let's focus on Congress. People should care more about the Congress. I mean, our system, the Congress should be the superior branch here, right? People talk about coeval branches, but really it's congressional supremacy. And the president shouldn't matter that much. Now, the president does. People get really worked up about the president. But one thing that I think happens is that we really care about identity. So we want a president with whom we can relate, right? Like, that's important to a lot of people. That's why Rolling Stone will have interviews with the president or the presidential candidates in which they talk about, my favorite book is X. And then if you read the interview and you're like, oh, that's my favorite book too, I'm going to vote for this person, as if that's like a good way to choose the president. But it makes people feel good to think that the people in power share their identity. That's important to people. That's not very important to me. I don't really care. So, I mean, but as long as people do care, I think they're going to emphasize the president, because this is one person with whom you can identify, and it means a lot to people. But if we didn't care about the president as much, if we cared more about the Congress and more about procedure and the Constitution, I think we would be less miserable about our political situation. Perhaps I'm still pessimistic, but a little bit less miserable, because we would think, hey, look, we have Ben Sass in there. We have you know, I don't Manchin, Cinema. We have some people who are, I'm sympathetic to, that I like the kind of, especially the moderate Democrats. I mean, I like Ben Sass better, but I like that there are these moderate Democrats in there. I like to think about the Congress and procedure more than about one individual. I think that's more important. I think it's healthier. That's what I would encourage. I doubt I'll be happy with the presidential candidate, because I just don't see a healthy candidate coming out of the Republican Party. I think DeSantis is probably the best hope, and I'm not a huge fan. That's not to say I'm implacably opposed to him or something. I could easily see myself voting for DeSantis, but I don't care as much about the president as I used to when I was like 20 or something. I care more about Congress.
Yeah, I think you're right insofar that the Congress as a body, no individual member of Congress is more powerful than the president, but Congress as a body is absolutely more powerful than the president. That's almost inarguable. The thing I feel about, the problem I have with that, though, is just that I think that there's kind of this opening with the presidency where there's a degree of novelty and interest where, like, if somebody runs an independent campaign for president, as long as they have a certain amount of notoriety and have a certain novelty to their candidacy, it could be anywhere from like Elon Musk or Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson or whoever running for president, and people would just be interested because it's like, oh, they're running for president. Yes. With Congress, you have to win 218 elections in the House and 51 in the Senate. Right. The idea of getting 270 candidates who are
right.
Whereas the president, you just need one person who has the right qualities. And, I mentioned Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and Elon Musk. Honestly, I'd probably prefer either of them to what we currently have, but neither of them would, obviously Elon Musk, they have their issues. But I say that just because with the presidency, there's kind of this little cheat where if you just get a certain amount of attention, even if you're just hitting like, isn't the Commission on Presidential Debates, I think you have to get 15% in the polls. If you can just drum up that much interest in your candidacy and get into the debates, and you present yourself as like, hey, America, do you hate the person to my left and to my right? Which a lot of America will say, hell yeah, I do, especially if Trump is the Republican candidate again. I think there's actually an opportunity that just shouldn't go without any attempt. So and that's why, yeah.
Well, let's suppose, though, in an ideal world, your ideal world, I guess, that you had, let's just say Jordan Peterson, he decides to run in the American election, he clears all the hurdles, whatever, we figure out a way that he can run. Okay, so Jordan Peterson runs. Let's suppose that he wins the election. What would that accomplish in your view? Because my view is that, yes, the president obviously has rhetorical power because he gets a lot of attention, or he or she gets a lot of attention, but actually pretty limited in real power other than foreign policy, which I think is good. I think the president should be very limited. So what would it actually achieve in your view?
I think there's a few things it would achieve. The most obvious is that the president can unilaterally take X number of actions, whether it's banning critical race theory in federal institutions. And so hypothetically, a president, Jordan Peterson, could do a lot. He could appoint somebody to be the Secretary of Education that can work on that stuff. But if we take away the policy aspect, from a cultural aspect, I know politics is ultimately downstream of culture. Like ultimately, who is elected president is a response to cultural desires that transform into political desires.
Right.
But I actually think that there is at least a little bit of a reverse effect where presidential elections, in a way that no other election does, they send a signal to the American public. They kind of affect people's brains. Like when Obama was elected, I always say it gave people the first ever like woke high, the feeling of being like, I did such a good thing by electing this black man. I just remember that was the general. Remember how people felt? It was like there was all the liberals and a lot of conservatives too were just like, we elected a black man president. How good does that feel? I was only 13 when it happened, so it wasn't, I was sort of absolved. Yeah. But there was this thing, and it sort of, I think, impacted how things developed over the course of the next several years. I think had Hillary Clinton been elected in 2016, you might have seen a similar thing going on with feminism. Instead, Donald Trump was elected, and what did we see? Think about the culture war situation pre-2017 and after. There's a phase shift there once Donald Trump is elected. And I do think that there's something that happens when a president is elected that changes the psyche of the country. And if you had a president like Jordan Peterson, it's sort of like the idea of the mandate, right? Especially if he won overwhelmingly, let's say hypothetically, we're playing, again, it is political fantasy. It is high fantasy when we have President Jordan Peterson. Yeah. But let's say hypothetically that, Jordan Peterson wins 60% of the vote. It does kind of, it makes people, let's say hypothetically, want to be on the winning team. It makes people go, now, wait a minute. What's going on here? And I do think that what happened in 2020, and I think that an extension of the election was the Capitol riot, that there was a psychological impact that was helpful to the left. I mean, look at what happened after the sort of racial reckoning. I think there are these pseudo-political events that have cultural impacts, and that presidential elections are the only elections that do that. No other election does that. Midterms don't do that. Presidential elections kind of, they at least put a thumb on the scale. They have an impact. They move the needle culturally in a way that I think gets lost, especially, I mean, think about, when Reagan was elected in 1980, when Obama was elected in 2008, there are these moments, FDR, there are presidents that can have this deeply felt impact on the American public.
Yeah, that's fair. That is fair. And I mean, it's an empirical question how much the particular president matters. I'm willing to accept that some presidents are transformational, both symbolically and perhaps in the way they affect like the American psyche, or they show that something can be accomplished that people didn't think could be accomplished. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I don't know that I like that. I kind of like a much more quiet president, one without pomp and circumstance, and I'm more procedural, but I have to accept political reality, and political reality is, at least symbolically, the president matters, and it does signal something. That said, I mean, there's not a chance that some unity ticket is going to do anything. I mean, it's just, in my view, that's
probably not.
I mean, I remember Nader in 2000, right? And I was a Nader fan at the time. I had seen him talk. I was very excited about it. And what happened? He got like 1% of the vote, and possibly,
well, he ended up electing George W. Bush.
Yes, possibly.
Really
there's a lot of debate about if those people would have voted otherwise, etc. But possibly, yeah. So, I'm very skeptical about it. And I think some people don't remember, like, Nader really provoked a lot of passion, right? Like, I mean, he was pretty popular. I mean, again, he only got like 1%, but he was very, especially with like some sort of disgruntled heterodox types like Pearl Jam and some famous actors and actresses. It was a big deal. And it was, to me, it was like sort of a slap in the face about political reality. It's like, look, now I'm not as radical as I was when I was that age either, but I learned a lesson just about like political reality. And I think it's important to be, I guess, aspirational is important as well, but also a realist. And in the real world, I mean, I'm not even particularly fond of Tulsi Gabbard or Andrew Yang. So I mean, those wouldn't be my ideal candidates anyway. But in the real political world, I guess the best that I could hope for would be Ben Sass, but that is a very, very long shot, I will say.
Yeah,
Like,
I mean, certainly in a Republican primary, but honestly, if he was an independent in a Trump-Biden 2024, I'm voting for Ben Sass. I mean, I don't know.
oh, I
Like,
would too.
yeah,
I
but
probably would
but
too.
most people probably wouldn't. But I don't know. I mean, it's if
But I
you
think
brand it the right way.
but one thing about Ben Sass though is that an important part of his philosophy is humility in the culture war and an acceptance of localism, right? And I think that's something that people don't want to hear, because people, it seems as though on the right, people have moved more toward the idea that we need to get somebody who fights the culture war from the top down, right? And that used to be something, at least rhetorically, that a lot of conservatives warned against and found unappealing. Like they would argue culture is local. You have to win the culture war in the culture. You don't win it from the president's White House, right? So Sass is very much a localist, very much a the culture war should be fought in the culture. And that's my view too, by the way, except for these things. I mean, I'm open to, you know, like CRT, we can debate and how could we do this. I'm open to those kinds of things, but I think the culture warning from the White House, I don't like it. It's a bad idea. I mean, maybe it's not a bad idea. It's off-putting to me. I just don't think I don't like that way of running things. I didn't like it, by the way, when Obama, when the Obama White House had the rainbow lights projected against the White House after the Obergefell decision. I was for gay marriage for a long time. I didn't like the decision because I don't think that's a constitutional issue, but that's fine. But I was still for it. Hypothetically, I was for the policy. I just thought that was a bad idea because it was making this, it was very culture warrior from the White House. And I just don't like that.
Yeah. Yeah. At the end of the day, the most likely way that you successfully push back against the woke orthodoxy is the same way that they got in, which is either by retaking institutions or just replacing institutions or just winning a battle of ideas that takes place outside the realm of politics. But right. I do think that what our discussion has hit on is that there are interesting intersections, as anyone knows, between culture and politics. And I'm very much of the opinion that the presidency as a concept should not be ignored, and that it intrigues me and it heartens me when I imagine, what if somebody who wasn't awful snuck in there? What if somebody, it really, really does. I really think, like, God, what you could, like, even if it was like, or even just somebody who's interested in, because I would say the number one problem with politicians today is they're completely untethered to the truth, the way that many people are. People don't care about the truth. And if you have somebody in the most powerful position who is at least a cursory interest in telling the truth to the American people, or adhering to the truth in the way that they govern, just a little bit, even not because, you know, at the end of the day, everybody lies a little bit, but just somebody who isn't completely untethered to the truth. If you could do that, the amount of good it would do, I think, is underestimated.
I am an underestimator of that. Then you would put me in that, because I am very skeptical that it would do that much. Now, I think probably the things that make a good president are things we don't think about, things that aren't tested publicly very much or in debates. Like, whatever one thinks about FDR, he was a political genius, right? Not because, I mean, he was pretty good at giving speeches. He had a sort of mellifluous voice or an appealing voice. He was kind of charismatic, but he was also really good at negotiating privately, right? He knew how to do those things in private that are really important. Politics, at least it used to be, I don't know how much it is. Like, Obama did not have this trait, but politics is a lot of the things that make a good politician maybe don't make you that good of a scientist or that good of a truth teller to the public or whatever, right? And that's, by the way, that's another reason I hate the primary system, because I would rather the party pick the candidate, because the party actually, they have better information about who the talented politician is, right? the public votes for a kind of charisma that they find appealing or whatever. I'm not sure how much that coincides with the best politician. And by best politician, I mean the president who would do the best job for the country. I don't know that those two correspond very closely. So I'm pretty skeptical about that. Now, you might be right. I'm open to it. It's an empirical question, but I guess it's both good and bad. It's bad because I don't see like this kind of solution. It's good because I don't get too worked up about it. You know, like if Biden happened, or if Kamala Harris, for example, which would be one of my least favorite possible candidates, if she were to win in 2024, life would go on. I would continue to attempt to persuade people that the excesses of progressivism are dangerous and that we should veer away from them. And I would write articles about it. And I don't think that much would change. I could be wrong about that. I think this said, one area where it actually really does matter and you can see it is immigration. And that's been more of a disaster under Biden than I thought it would be. And that's something I do care about. So I want to be clear, like it does matter. It's like I would prefer DeSantis to Harris. I just don't think it matters quite as much as many people seem to think.
We'll have to find out. It
right,
is,
that's
it is
right.
early.
It's an empirical issue, and I'm happy to come on here in 2026 and say, man, Harris was more of a disaster than I could have imagined.
Or that President Jordan Peterson has solved all of our problems. But in any case, Bo, this has been a great conversation. We could go for hours, and I look forward to having you on again another time. And we'll stay away from the presidential election stuff. Well, there's all sorts of interesting stuff to talk to you about.
Lots of interesting stuff. Yes.
So I'm definitely gonna have you back on. I love these conversations. We always go a little long when you're on, which I like. It means I'm having a particularly good conversation.
Yes, absolutely. Okay.
Because Joe Rogan's able to have these like 3 hour long. I just can't get guests to sit for 3 hours for the most part.
Oh, I could do 3 hours.
All right, okay. You know what? So I'll say this and this goes for my viewers too. I have been considering strongly doing round tables on this channel that would be at least 2 hours longer, at least an hour and a half. Bo, you're like a top of my list to have some kind of round table discussion.
What's a round? Is that where there are multiple people?
I'll have multiple guests. Oh, yeah. And whether I would play the sort of moderator role or actually participate I'm still considering, but it's something that I'm considering strongly for this channel. I definitely want to do, because I've had a lot of people on this channel at this point, and I think why not get some of these people to interact? Yeah. So Bo, you are definitely top of my list
thing to do.
To have it a round table and to have back on the channel.
I would always be delighted.
Wonderful. All right. Well, look forward to that, people. I'm gonna start working on that. And then, Bo, before we go, is there anything, I don't want to forget, anything you want to promote while you're on the show today?
No, I'm in a lull. I'm just doing research and stuff.
You're hanging back.
Exactly. But I'll let you know later if anything comes up.
Sounds good. All right, people. Well, do you want to maybe drop your Twitter?
I don't remember my actual address.
Then you really are in a lull. So
yeah,
you are
if you write my name in, if you type my name in, you can find me.
I'm going to do it for you. I want people to follow you on
Twitter. I've sort of been on a bit of a Twitter hiatus, just kind of becoming disenchanted with the Twitter game. But
I will just say, if you liked hearing from Bo, it looks like you're EPO.
Yeah, that's right.
187.
That's right.
On Twitter. Yeah. So if you want to hear more from Bo, I like talking to him. I like hearing from him, and I definitely recommend following him on Twitter. He's on a bit of a lull right now, obviously, but you're a great person to talk to. You're really in the sweet spot, Bo. People who haven't fallen into either of the kind of psychoses I think that currently exist, the Trump psychosis and the woke psychosis, that's who I want to have on the show. And you're right in that sweet spot.
I like to think I'm the most rational person in the room, but then I think everybody thinks that.
Yeah, I know.
So I think I'm the most rational in the sense that everybody thinks they are.
Yeah. But anyway, Bo, look forward to having you back on. Thanks everyone for listening. If you are listening to the show on iTunes, don't forget to leave a 5-star review. Really helps get the show to more people. And if you are listening on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe. We had a really interesting discussion, so I'd love to hear what some of you people thought about what we discussed today. And with that, I will see you all next time on the Veritas podcast.